Winter, 1944. 200 German women arrive at a Texas POW camp expecting revenge. They had been told America was chaos, that prisoners would face only cruelty. Instead, they find clean barracks, warm bread, and something they never anticipated: mercy. On Christmas morning, a guard announces there will be no labor. What follows isn't punishment, it's a banquet. A simple meal that shatters years of propaganda and leaves these women weeping, asking a question they'd never dared ask. If these are the monsters, what have we been? This is how kindness defeated hatred, how one act of grace proved more powerful than any weapon. The train whistle cut through the fog like a knife, sharp and mournful, echoing across the flat expanse of rural Texas. Inside the cramped boxcars, 200 German women pressed against wooden walls, their breath forming clouds in the freezing air. They were Red Cross nurses, radio operators, clerks, women who had served the Third Reich and now found themselves prisoners in a land they had been taught to despise. Anna Vogel sat with her knees drawn to her chest, her journal clutched against her body. At 23, she still carried the idealism of youth, though it had been battered by war's realities. She had joined the German Red Cross, believing she would save lives, believing in the righteousness of her nation's cause. Even now, after capture, after the long Atlantic crossing, she held on to fragments of that belief. Germany would rise again. It had to. The train lurched to a stop. They stumbled onto the platform, blinking in pale winter light, and what they saw made no sense. Before them stretched neat rows of wooden barracks, freshly painted, smoke rising from chimneys. Laundry lines hung between buildings, white sheets flapping like flags of surrender. And the guards, the American guards, were not scowling or shouting. Some were even smiling. They had been told America was chaos, a nation of mongrels and criminals where order had collapsed. But this place was frighteningly calm, too calm. Anna had prepared herself for brutality, for revenge. She had not prepared herself for kindness. As they were led through the gates, Anna noticed a woman near the mess hall, watching them with an expression neither hostile nor welcoming, simply observant. She was older, perhaps 40, wearing a simple dress and flour-dusted apron. Her hair was pulled back in a practical bun. There was something maternal about her stance that made Anna's throat tighten. That night, lying on a clean bunk with a wool blanket that smelled of soap, Anna opened her journal and wrote by candlelight, "If this is defeat, then I do not understand victory." The mess hall buzzed with whispered German, fragments of conversation bouncing off wooden walls like nervous birds. The women huddled at long tables, picking at their meals with suspicion, as if the food itself might be poisoned. They had been given hot bread, real bread, not the sawdust mixture they'd eaten during the final months in Europe. There was soup with vegetables, beans that were tender, even small portions of butter, but instead of gratitude, there was confusion, and beneath the confusion, fear. Hilda Brenner, a sharp-faced woman in her 30s who had worked as a radio operator in Normandy, pushed her plate away with disgust. "It's propaganda," she hissed. "They fatten us before the trial, make us soft, make us forget what we are. Then they parade us in front of cameras before they execute us." Several heads nodded. It made sense. It had to. Because the alternative, that their captors were simply following the rules of war, treating them as human beings, contradicted everything they had been taught about the enemy. Anna wanted to argue, but words stuck in her throat. She had heard the rumors filtering through the barracks late at night. American prisoners in German camps were starving. Some were dying. Red Cross packages stolen, the Geneva Convention ignored. If that was true, then why were they being treated so differently here? From across the room, Margaret Hall watched the German women with careful attention. She stood behind the serving counter, supervising the distribution of rations with the same meticulous care she had once used to feed her own family. Margaret was the camp matron, responsible for kitchens and domestic operations. She was a Methodist who believed in duty and decency, though both had been tested by the telegram that arrived 16 months ago, informing her that her son, Thomas, had been killed at Anzio. She had not wanted this job, but duty and the need for income had won out. Now, watching these women refuse the pork she had prepared, not from religious conviction, but from stubborn pride, she felt anger mixed with pity. They carried their loyalty like a weapon against kindness itself. Sunday morning arrived cold and clear, frost sparkling on the ground like scattered diamonds. At precisely 9 o'clock, singing drifted across the camp from the recreation hall where American soldiers and staff gathered for weekly service. The hymns were simple, familiar, Amazing Grace, Come Thou Fount, Abide With Me, sung in plain English by voices blending into something earnest and moving. Anna stood near the eastern fence, hands wrapped around wire, listening. She had positioned herself there deliberately, drawn by something she couldn't name. In Germany, she had attended church irregularly, more from social obligation than faith. But here, in this foreign place, the music touched something deeper. Perhaps it was loneliness. Perhaps it was the recognition that these people, her captors, prayed to the same God. She found a gap in the barracks wall, a crack between weathered boards, and pressed her eye against it. Through the narrow opening, she could see into the hall. Soldiers sat on folding chairs, hymnals in hand. At the front, a chaplain in uniform led them through verses. And there, in the back row, was the woman from the mess hall, the one with the flour-dusted apron and sad eyes. Margaret Hall sang quietly, her voice barely audible, hands folded in her lap. There was something broken in her posture, something that spoke of loss carried privately. When the service ended and people filed out, Margaret paused. She turned toward the barracks, and for a moment Anna was certain their eyes met through that crack in the wood. Margaret's expression didn't change, but she walked to the window nearest the fence and placed something on the sill. Then she left. Anna waited until the compound was quiet before approaching. On the sill sat a single biscuit wrapped in clean paper. She stared at it for a long time. She didn't touch it. She didn't eat it. But she couldn't stop looking at it either. It was the first crack in the wall of hate. The newspaper clipping arrived wrapped in a prisoner's undergarment, smuggled through channels Anna didn't understand and didn't want to know. It was passed from hand to hand in the barracks after lights out, read by candlelight with trembling fingers. The headline was bold, defiant. Berlin resists. Reich forces hold the line. But the date was 3 weeks old, and the article itself was vague, full of the empty rhetoric that had become standard in the final months. Anna read it twice, searching for truth between the propaganda. Her hands trembled as she folded it and passed it along. She knew what the others couldn't or wouldn't accept. The war was lost. Berlin wasn't resisting. It was dying. The Reich wasn't holding the line. It was collapsing. But to say it aloud would be treason. Even here, even as prisoners, that old fear held them silent. The next morning, Anna overheard 2 guards talking outside the barracks. She understood more English than she let on, a skill she developed carefully, listening to American radio broadcasts before her capture. "Lieutenant Campbell says we treat them like any other prisoners," one guard said. "By the book. Geneva Convention, no exceptions. Even after what they did to our boys. Especially after that. He says they're women, not prisoners of vengeance." Anna pressed herself against the wall, hardly breathing. Later that day, she saw Margaret Hall standing near the kitchen, and she watched as the lieutenant approached. Their voices carried in the still air. "You're sure about the Christmas plans?" Margaret asked. Campbell nodded. "Let them see mercy. That's what breaks the chains. Not punishment, not revenge. Mercy." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "My son didn't get mercy. No, Campbell agreed. He didn't, but that's exactly why we have to give it. Anna turned away, her chest tight. She didn't understand these Americans. She didn't understand their logic, their kindness, their strange commitment to rules, even when rules seemed foolish. In that moment, something in her certainty began to shift just slightly, like ice cracking beneath weight. Christmas Eve morning broke crisp and clear, the sky washed pale blue above the camp. The women rose as usual, preparing for another day of labor. Laundry duty, kitchen work, maintenance tasks. They dressed in their worn uniforms and formed lines outside the barracks, breath steaming in the cold air, waiting for the guards to assign them to their stations. But when the guard arrived, he didn't carry the usual clipboard. Instead, he cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted in heavily accented German, "No labor today. The commander says it's Christmas." The women froze. 200 pairs of eyes stared at him in confusion. "What?" someone called out. "No work," the guard repeated, slower now. "It's Christmas. Holiday." Hilda stepped forward, suspicious. "But prisoners' work. That's the rule." The guard shrugged, almost apologetic. "Not today. Commander's orders." Silence fell over the compound. The women looked at each other, searching for understanding, for explanation. This had to be a trick, a test, some new form of psychological warfare they hadn't anticipated. But the guard simply turned and walked away, leaving them standing there in the cold morning light. Anna watched as, across the yard, the recreation hall's doors opened. American soldiers were carrying tables inside, their arms full of white sheets, paper garlands, and boxes that clinked with the sound of dishes. Someone was setting up a Christmas tree, a real tree, its branches full and green, the scent of pine carrying across the compound in the wind. Through the windows, she could see candles being lit, could see more tables being arranged in neat rows, could see Margaret Hall directing the work with quiet efficiency, her flour-dusted apron replaced with a clean dress. Anna's breath caught. The decorations weren't for the Americans alone. The hall was too large, the preparations too extensive. Those tables were being set for everyone. For them. "They're preparing something," Erica whispered beside her. "But what?" Anna couldn't answer. She could only watch as paper garlands were strung from the rafters, as American flags were placed alongside small evergreen branches, as the impossible slowly became real before her eyes. Lieutenant Campbell found Margaret in the kitchen 2 days before Christmas, her hands deep in flour, kneading dough with the mechanical precision of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. He stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking, knowing what he was about to ask would cost her something. "Margaret," he said quietly, "I need you to cook for everyone on Christmas Day. Americans and German women. Same meal, same portions." Her hands stopped moving. She didn't look up. "The same?" "No differences," Campbell confirmed. "We feed them what we eat. Turkey, stuffing, potatoes, pie. Everything." Margaret's jaw tightened. She thought of Thomas, her boy, 20 years old, when he died on that Italian beach. She thought of the telegram, the flag, the empty chair at her own table last Christmas. And now this man was asking her to cook a feast for the women whose countrymen had killed her son. "Sir, I don't—" "I know," Campbell interrupted gently. "I know what I'm asking, but it's the right thing. It's what the convention requires, and it's what we should do regardless." Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she returned to the dough. She worked it harder now, pressing her weight into it, feeling the resistance. Finally, she nodded without looking at him. "I'll do it, but not because I want to." "I wouldn't expect you to want to," Campbell said. "Thank you, Margaret." That afternoon, guards moved through the women's barracks with an announcement that felt like a fever dream. The prisoners were to wash, put on their cleanest uniforms, and assemble at the dining hall at 5 o'clock. No explanation was given. No context provided. Just the order, delivered in broken German, leaving confusion in its wake. Anna stood before the small mirror in the washroom, scrubbing her face with cold water, trying to make sense of it. Around her, women whispered theories, each more outlandish than the last. A propaganda film, a Red Cross inspection, some kind of Christmas service where they'd be forced to renounce their loyalty. But none of it explained the smells drifting from the kitchen, roasting meat, baking bread, something sweet and spiced that made her stomach ache with memory. The doors to the dining hall opened at precisely 5 o'clock, and the German women filed in slowly, hesitantly, like children entering a room where they expected punishment but couldn't see the threat. What they found instead stopped them in their tracks. Long wooden tables stretched the length of the hall, covered in white sheets that had been pressed and smoothed until they gleamed in the candlelight. Real plates sat at each place setting. Not the tin mess kits they'd been using, but actual ceramic plates with simple blue patterns around the edges. Glasses sparkled beside them. Cloth napkins were folded into triangles, and at the center of each table sat pies, apple, pumpkin, their crusts golden brown and still steaming. In the corner, an upright piano stood with an American soldier seated at the bench. As the women entered, his fingers moved across the keys, and the opening notes of Silent Night filled the space. The melody was unmistakable, transcending language, reaching into memories of Christmases before the war, before the ideology, before everything fell apart. The women walked in cautiously, their eyes darting from the tables to the American guards who stood along the walls. They expected mockery. Some cruel joke where the food would be snatched away, where they'd be laughed at for believing even for a moment that this was real. Instead, the guards nodded politely. One even pulled out a chair for an older woman who walked with a cane. Anna felt her throat close. She moved to a seat near the middle, her hands gripping the back of the chair. Beside her, Erica sat down mechanically, staring at the plate in front of her as if it might disappear. Across the table, Hilda's face was rigid with suspicion, but even she couldn't hide the confusion in her eyes. "This," Anna whispered, barely audible over the piano. "Is this for us?" No one answered because no one knew. They could only sit and wait and try to understand what was happening. Lieutenant Campbell stood at the front of the hall, his uniform pressed, his expression calm and measured. He waited until all the women were seated, until the last notes of Silent Night faded into silence. Then he raised his hands slightly, a gesture that commanded attention without demanding it. "Today," he began, speaking slowly so the few women who understood English could translate for the others. "There are no enemies in this room, only souls, only people. We are gathered to observe Christmas, a day that belongs to all who wish to honor it." Anna listened to the hurried translations rippling through the tables, watched as comprehension and disbelief mingled on faces around her. Campbell's words were simple, almost plain, but their weight was enormous. He gestured to Margaret, who stood near the kitchen doorway, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Mrs. Hall will say grace. I ask that you respect this moment, regardless of your own beliefs." Margaret stepped forward, her face pale but composed. She looked out at the sea of German women, at their young faces and tired eyes, and something inside her wavered. She had rehearsed what she would say, but now the words felt inadequate. "Lord," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "we thank you for this food and for this day. We ask that you watch over all those who are far from home, all those who hunger, all those who grieve. May we remember that your mercy extends beyond borders, beyond uniforms, beyond all that divides us. Amen." The women glanced at one another, uncertain whether to bow their heads, whether to acknowledge the prayer. Some did, some didn't, but all of them felt its sincerity. The kitchen doors swung open, and American soldiers began carrying out trays, enormous platters of roasted turkey, golden and glistening. Bowls of mashed potatoes, boats of gravy, dishes of green beans and carrots, and stuffing that smelled of sage and butter. The food kept coming, more than they'd seen in years, arranged on the tables like an offering. When the first tray of turkey was placed in front of their table, no one moved. They stared at it, this impossible abundance, and couldn't bring themselves to reach for it. It felt like a trap. It had to be. Then Lotta, the youngest among them, barely 19, picked up the serving fork with shaking hands. She placed a small slice on her plate, cut a piece, and brought it to her mouth. The moment she tasted it, her face crumpled. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she covered her mouth with her hand, trying to hold back sobs. That broke the dam. One by one, the women began to cry, not all at once, not dramatically, but in quiet, devastating waves. Some covered their faces with their napkins. Others bent over their plates, shoulders shaking. A few simply sat frozen, tears streaming silently down their cheeks while their hands remained motionless on the table. Anna felt it rising in her chest, a pressure that had been building for months, maybe years. She pressed her hands against her face and whispered in German, "They treat us like humans. They treat us like humans." Around her, the breaking continued. Hilda, who had been so certain this was propaganda, stared at her untouched plate with tears dripping onto the white tablecloth. Erica ate slowly, mechanically, each bite accompanied by quiet sobs. Even the older women, the ones who'd maintained their dignity through capture and transport and imprisonment, found themselves undone by simple kindness. From her position near the kitchen, Margaret watched it happen. She saw these women who wore the uniform of the enemy, who represented the nation that had taken her son, collapse under the weight of mercy. And something in her chest broke too. She felt tears sliding down her own cheeks, felt the hard shell of anger she'd been carrying crack open. It was not hunger that broke them. It was not the quality of the food or the abundance of it. It was the simple, devastating recognition that they had been wrong. That the monsters they'd been taught to fear had shown them more humanity than their own leaders ever had. Anna's hands shook as she reached for her journal, tucked into the pocket of her uniform. She pulled it out along with the stub of a pencil and wrote, right there at the table, her handwriting barely legible through her tears. "If they are the monsters, what have we been?" The question hung in her mind, unanswerable and terrible. She looked up at Margaret, at Lieutenant Campbell, at the American guards who stood quietly along the walls, giving them space to break, space to feel. And she understood that this moment would define the rest of her life. After the meal, as the women sat in stunned silence with their empty plates before them, Lieutenant Campbell stood again. He announced that each woman would be given a Red Cross form, a standard letter template that would be mailed to their families in Germany, letting them know they were alive and well. The forms were distributed, along with pencils, and for several minutes the only sound was the scratch of graphite on paper. Anna stared at hers for a long time before writing. What could she say? How could she explain what had happened here? Finally, she began. "Dear Mama, I am well. I am being treated fairly. The Americans—" She paused, crossed it out, and started again. "The enemy prays before eating. They have given us dignity we denied them. I do not understand this war anymore. I do not understand what we were told. I think I've been lied to about many things." She folded the letter carefully, placed it in the envelope provided, and set it on the stack with the others. Around her, women were doing the same, each letter a small act of confession, of awakening. Margaret collected the letters, holding the stack gently as if they were fragile. As she walked them to the mailroom, she paused. From her pocket, she withdrew a small Bible, worn leather, pages soft from use, and tucked it into the stack. On the inside cover, she'd written in careful script, "Peace begins where vengeance ends. A mother who lost her son but refuses to lose her soul." She sealed the mailbag and handed it to the guard. Somewhere in Germany, mothers would receive these letters. They would read their daughters' words and perhaps begin to question too. It was a small thing, a tiny crack in the edifice of hatred. But small cracks, Margaret knew, were where light got in. Christmas morning arrived wrapped in snow. Soft, silent flakes had fallen through the night, covering the camp in a blanket of white that muffled sound and softened edges. The barracks, the fences, the guard towers, all of it looked gentler somehow, transformed by nature into something almost peaceful. Inside the women's quarters, Anna woke early to the sound of humming. At first, she thought she was dreaming, but as consciousness returned, she realized the sound was real. Soft, tentative voices were humming Stille Nacht, silent night, not singing the words, just the melody, passing from bunk to bunk like a whispered prayer. She sat up slowly, wrapping her thin blanket around her shoulders. Around her, women were rising, moving to the windows to look out at the snow. Some were smiling, actually smiling for the first time since their capture. Others stood quietly, lost in thought, perhaps remembering Christmases before the war, before everything changed. Hilda, who had been so certain of American cruelty, sat on her bunk with her head in her hands. She wasn't crying, but her shoulders were hunched with the weight of recognition. Yesterday had broken something in her, shattered the certainty she'd clung to like armor. When the guard came for morning count, he found something unexpected pinned to the barracks door. A piece of paper, torn from a notebook, with words written in careful German script. "Danke, for showing us Christmas." The guard unpinned it carefully and took it to Margaret, who was already in the kitchen preparing breakfast. She read it standing by the window, morning light streaming across the page, and her hands trembled slightly as she held it. She folded it with reverence, as if it were something sacred, and tucked it into the pocket of her apron. "They thanked us," she whispered to no one in particular. "After everything, they thanked us." She stood there for a long moment, looking out at the snow-covered compound, at the women beginning to emerge from their barracks, their faces softer than they'd been the day before. Something had shifted. Some invisible barrier had fallen, and Margaret understood that she'd been part of something larger than herself, larger than her grief, larger than the war. She touched the note in her pocket again, and for the first time in 16 months, she felt something like peace. News of the Christmas banquet spread through military channels with surprising speed. By New Year's, other POW camp commanders had heard about what happened in Texas, how Lieutenant Campbell had fed German prisoners the same meal as American soldiers, how the women had wept, how mercy had achieved what interrogation never could. The reactions were mixed. Some officers saw it as a model, a demonstration of how adherence to the Geneva Convention could break down enemy resistance more effectively than harsh treatment. Others were outraged, calling it weakness, a betrayal of American soldiers who died at German hands. At a regional meeting in January, a colonel from a neighboring camp confronted Campbell directly. "You coddle the enemy," he said, his voice sharp with accusation. "While our boys are dying in Europe, you're serving turkey dinners to Nazi women. It's an insult to every man in uniform." Campbell listened quietly, his expression unchanged. When the colonel finished, he responded in a measured tone that somehow carried more weight than shouting ever could. "I've read the reports from camps that use harsh treatment," Campbell said. "The prisoners remain defiant, loyal to the Reich, unchanged. In my camp, we've had women renounce their allegiance, cooperate with intelligence officers, and write letters home, questioning everything they were taught." He paused. letting that sink in. If mercy is weakness, then may the world never be strong again, because I'll take changed hearts over broken bodies any day. The room fell silent. Some officers nodded slowly. Others looked away, uncomfortable with the challenge to their assumptions. But Campbell's words began to circulate, repeated in officers' clubs and command meetings, planting seeds of doubt about the effectiveness of cruelty. Margaret heard about the confrontation from one of the guards. She found Campbell later that day, standing by the fence, watching the women in their compound. They were playing cards, talking, laughing quietly, behavior that would have been unthinkable 2 weeks ago. "Thank you," Margaret said simply. "For what you said, for what you did." Campbell shook his head. "I just followed the rules, Margaret. Sometimes that's all it takes. Just following the rules like they actually matter." "No," she insisted. "You did more than that. You showed them who we really are, who we're supposed to be." He smiled slightly. "Maybe they showed us too." 3 days after Christmas, Anna found Margaret near the kitchen garden, checking on winter vegetables beneath their protective straw covering. The camp was quiet in the late afternoon, most people inside seeking warmth. Anna had been working up her courage for this conversation all day. "Mrs. Hall?" she said softly, her English tentative but understandable. Margaret turned, surprised. She'd known some of the women understood English, but hadn't expected direct conversation. "Yes?" Anna stepped closer, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold. Her face was serious, searching. "I need to ask you something. It's difficult." "Go ahead." "Did you hate us?" Anna's voice cracked slightly on the question. "Before Christmas, when we arrived, did you hate us?" Margaret's first instinct was to soften the truth, to spare this young woman's feelings. But something in Anna's eyes told her that dishonesty would be a greater cruelty than the truth. "Yes," Margaret said quietly. "I did. My son died in Italy. He was 20 years old. And when you arrived, all I could see was the uniform, the country that killed him. I hated all of you." Anna's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "And now?" Margaret took a long breath, considering. "It died. That hate, it died on Christmas night, when I watched you women cry over a simple meal, when I saw you realize you'd been lied to. I couldn't hold on to it anymore. It just died." Anna's composure crumbled. She pressed her hands to her face, sobbing openly now. "Then maybe there's hope for us too," she managed between gasps. "If you can stop hating us, maybe we can stop being what they made us. Maybe we can become something else." Without thinking, both women moved toward the fence that separated them. Margaret reached through the wire, and Anna grasped her hand. They stood there, guard and prisoner, enemy and enemy, holding hands through twisted metal while snow began to fall again. "There's always hope," Margaret whispered. "That's what Christmas was supposed to teach us. There's always hope for redemption." Anna nodded, squeezing Margaret's hand. At that moment, the war felt very far away. At that moment, they were just two women who'd lost too much and found something unexpected in each other. May 8th, 1945. The radio crackled to life in the recreation hall, and the announcement came through in waves of static. "Germany has surrendered. The war in Europe is over." In the American barracks, there was celebration, shouting, crying, embraces. Men who'd been holding their breath for years finally exhaled. The nightmare was ending. They could go home. In the women's compound, the reaction was different. Anna stood with the others, listening to the news in stunned silence. It was over. Everything they'd believed in, everything they'd fought for, it was finished. Germany had fallen. The Reich was no more. Some women wept. Others stood frozen, faces blank with shock. Hilda sat down heavily on the ground, staring at nothing. The world they'd known had ended. and what would replace it was terrifyingly uncertain. But Anna felt something unexpected rising in her chest. Not grief, not despair, relief. The war was over. The killing would stop, and maybe, just maybe, they could begin to build something new from the ruins. The months that followed were bureaucratic, slow. There were interviews, paperwork, arrangements for repatriation. The camp began to empty as women were processed and sent home. Some went eagerly, desperate to find surviving family members. Others went reluctantly, afraid of what they'd find in a defeated Germany. In September, Anna stood on the deck of a transport ship, watching the American coast recede into the distance. Her journal was tucked safely in her coat pocket, every page filled now with observations, revelations, confessions. She touched it through the fabric, reassuring herself it was still there. Around her, other women stood at the railing, silent or talking quietly. They were going home, but they were not the same people who'd left. Something fundamental had changed in them, broken and rebuilt into a different shape. Anna whispered to herself, words meant for no one but carried away by the wind. They didn't defeat us, they redeemed us. "20 years later, on an autumn morning in 1964, Margaret Hall received a letter. She was older now, her hair completely gray, living in a small house in the Texas town where she'd spent most of her life. The POW camp was long closed, turned into farmland, the barracks torn down and forgotten by everyone except those who'd been there. The letter had German stamps and unfamiliar handwriting. Margaret opened it carefully at her kitchen table, smoothing the pages with hands that had developed arthritis. "Dear Mrs. Hall," it began in careful English. "You may not remember me. My name is Anna Vogel, though I was Anna Schmidt when we met. I was a prisoner at the camp where you worked during the war. I was the one who held your hand through the fence on that day after Christmas." Margaret's breath caught. She remembered. Of course she remembered. The letter continued. "I wanted you to know what became of me. I returned to Germany and found my family, what was left of it. I worked as a nurse in the rebuilding, helping wherever I could. I met a good man, a teacher, who'd also learned hard lessons during the war. We are married and we have a daughter." Margaret's eyes moved down the page. "Her name is Margaret. I named her after you. She is 6 years old now, smart and kind, and she knows the story of Christmas, 1944. She knows about the American woman who showed mercy when she had every reason for revenge. She knows that story because I never want her to forget what hatred costs and what grace can accomplish." Margaret's vision blurred with tears. She read the final lines through them. "Thank you for seeing me as human when I had forgotten how to be one. Thank you for breaking the chains with kindness. I think of that Christmas every year and I pray that the world learns what you taught me, that peace begins where vengeance ends. With eternal gratitude, Anna." Margaret folded the letter carefully and held it against her chest. Outside, leaves were falling from trees. Children were playing in the street. Life was continuing in its ordinary, precious way. And somewhere in Germany, a little girl named Margaret was growing up in a world that, despite everything, still had room for hope. Sometimes victory isn't found in battles won, but in hearts changed. Sometimes the greatest triumph is not defeating your enemy, but helping them become your friend. And sometimes, in the darkest winters, a simple act of mercy can echo across decades, transforming not just one life, but generations. The war had ended 20 years ago, but the peace it created was still being written, one small act of kindness at a time.